Cool. So yeah, for those of you who have joined already, we're just going to keep the structure of this talk similar to all the previous guest talks we've had recently. So while Tim is speaking, you can all post questions as they come to you in our guest lectures Slack channel, and I'll call on you to share those out during the Q&A portion. And I was just saying to Tim and Kamal, I think it's nice to actually have those questions there in the group Slack anyways, so that we can kind of refer back to them and have threads about them. And like Shelley was suggesting, perhaps answer the questions that you ask so that the answers from the speakers are recorded there, and so you don't always have to go back to the recording if you want to remember something. So I think that's a good idea. Yeah. So I think, yeah, it's 8:03. I mean, Kamal, do you think we should just get started with the intro and people can keep joining as they please? I think I've covered most of the Slack and Zoom logistics here.
Sure.
And
Yeah,
I can turn it over to you for the intro. Okay.
I'm happy to get started. So
Great.
it gives me a great delight to introduce our very own Tim Falls. As you now know how this goes, I'll do the formal introduction and then tell a little story. So Tim is strategic advisor to Weaver. He entered the world of technology startups in 2009 while in graduate school earning his MBA. He has worked as a full-time employee, freelance consultant, mentor, advisor, independent board member, and friend to entrepreneurs building early to growth stage companies. Community defines Tim's profession. He specializes in devising community-oriented strategies and assembling and training teams to foster inclusive, diverse communities that support its members and the organizations that bring them together. Today, Tim is exploring new professional avenues and following his heart to focus his energy on climate action, and I believe on climate justice as well. In this case study and discussion, Tim will share a recent experience leading employee efforts to initiate conversations and spark progress toward a better organizational response to climate change. So I wanted to share that I actually invited Tim to give this talk before he decided to sign up as a student at Terra. And it's because I saw a version of this talk posted on the Climate Action Tech Slack channel. And I saw that and I thought, wow, this is amazing. Like, this is exactly the kind of thing that we want every single one of our learners to feel empowered to do, that they can actually start something right where they work and try and shift the conversation and actually, get moving on some climate action. So I was really excited when I saw that on CAT, and I thought, oh, we definitely need this guy to come and speak to our learners. And then later on, Tim decided to sign on as a student, so it's double the bonus that we get to have him in our cohort as well. I also think it's sort of deeply connected to Tim's very, I would say, deep connection to the world of justice, because it's again about empowering people who otherwise may not feel empowered to take action right where they are in their lived communities and in their lived workplaces. So I feel like this sort of really connects to the kind of work that Tim's kind of trying to do now as well. So I'm really excited to have him give this talk, and I'm going to hand over to you, Tim. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was an awesome introduction. And thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm excited to share this today. Since I live way out in the middle of nowhere and have pretty slow internet, if things start to get shaky with my video or audio, just wave and I'll pay attention and see if we can correct things. But until then, I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen and jump into this. Okay, can everyone see a big green screen? Okay. Put it in presentation mode. So this is just a little title which Kamal already went over, and to touch on the kind of sub headline here, This was an effort that did start as a 24-hour hackathon and kind of evolved from there into a bigger employee-led movement. So as an agenda of what we'll cover today, I'll go through an overview of the process and show you kind of the end product of our efforts. And then I'll just reflect on the requirements that went into it, the challenges we experienced, the results, and the key takeaways that I think are most important for this audience. So before I do that, let me jump over to this. All right, everybody see a spreadsheet now? Okay, so this is, I tried to keep everything in one place in the original workspace that we started during the hackathon, which was a simple Google Sheet. And I'll share this with everyone. It's can be used as a template if you would like to use it as such. All of the formulas and all the cells are linked to one another within each tab. And then I'll also go back over to the Google Slides, which is also linked to this in case you wanted to duplicate these and use them in your own efforts. So I won't read through all the words on this tab, on this worksheet, but it's basically just an overview of what I've just explained and a little bit of instruction on how to use it. And this is pretty close to the original version of when we came out of the hackathon, so it's a little rough around the edges. But I will note that I made an effort to make it more accessible to web readers by checking on all the colors that I used and the contrast in those colors to make it as viewable to people with vision problems as possible. So if any of that doesn't come out well, please give me feedback so I can adjust it for others. It's basically a navigation, from left to right through the tabs. So I'll just kind of walk through that. Here's a kind of getting started page for anyone who's jumping into this process for the first time. How do we even start thinking about the process of understanding our carbon footprint as an organization? There's a lot of things that our organization might undertake. Some of them are well within our view, and some of them are way outside of our view. Maybe a lot of our carbon footprint happens somewhere else in the supply chain that we don't have control over or much visibility into. So it can be challenging just to figure out, like, where do we start? Our approach to that was to really be specific and explicit with defining a purpose and defining the intended immediate outcomes. Why are we doing this? And what do we expect to come out of this effort? For us, it was just to really get that baseline understanding of a ballpark number as to what are we having, what kind of impact are we having on the environment through our bottom line operations. And an extension of that intention and intended outcome was to share that information, the information that we gathered about ourselves and the self-awareness we built with our customers, so that our customers could also make more informed decisions on whether or not they wanted to be customers of ours and how they wanted to make their purchase decisions, what products and services they would purchase from us. With that in mind, we just jumped into a brainstorming session. I think this is kind of the next step in the process, which is, okay, if that's what we want to achieve here, and maybe your version of this is we're just going to work at a team level or a departmental level and just really figure out what is our marketing departments or our people department or engineering department, what is our carbon footprint. And then you just jump into, like, what are the obvious things that we think might be leading to carbon emissions or any kind of environmental impact. And so this is the result of our brainstorming, we basically came up with a number of categories of emissions categories. And then that brings us to, once we identified those categories, now let's look into those things, do some research and analysis, and try to start understanding all these different activities. So that kind of brings us into each of the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tabs, each of which is a category. I'll jump real quickly over to the Tools and Resources tab, because while this is a case study in and of itself, I wanted to illuminate a couple other case studies from other companies. One here is from Basecamp, the company behind the new Hey email app, and what they did, what they've kind of measured. You can see they included banking as one of the categories, which I thought was interesting. Cloud hosting, they do a lot of printing of books, so that was something unique to their business that they wanted to cover. And also give another example from this gaming company called Space Ape, and they also in this article link to their actual Google spreadsheet that they used. So another good example and model to follow if you want to. So back to our model. We're at the research and analysis phase, and because this company, which I kind of didn't mention in the getting started tab, but this company was about 550 employees. It was a cloud hosting company, so we had data centers that we owned and operated around the world on several different continents, employees and customers all over the world. And so when we were in that brainstorming stage, thinking about, okay, where are the bulk of our emissions going to come from, we immediately started with data centers because that was an obvious choice. For companies who aren't data heavy, don't own their own data centers, this might not be the #1 category, but a lot of companies do operate their stuff in the cloud, and this research and analysis, because it is a cloud hosting, centered around a cloud hosting company, there's a lot of that. And we analyzed a lot of our competitors as well. Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, Amazon Web Services. So no matter what business you're running, if you have a technology aspect to it, you're likely going to be hosting some stuff in the cloud, and that would be one area you'd want to look into. And that is, if you're hosting with someone else, obviously one of those areas that might be out of your control from a decision-making standpoint, but you might be able to vote with your dollar as you choose vendors. So just jumping into all these different, this is really where the math hits the road. And I won't go through all the details of this, but again, if you want to click around in here and see what the formulas are and the math behind everything, I tried to highlight all of kind of the big numbers that would appear in the end summary in the green boxes. And there's lots of different kind of areas of contributing math, if you will, and lots of the resources and research links that we used to come up with all this stuff on our own that might be interesting to you if you jump into this process yourself, different definitions and whatnot. And I did take out any specific information to our data center providers and all that, just to keep things kosher in that regard. Going on to the next category of emissions, we have offices and operations. And again, this was our company of 550 employees, had about 200 folks in one office, and maybe another 50 to 100 folks in other offices. So let's say 250 to 300 employees distributed around the world working from home. So we had to take all of that into consideration in terms of who's in the office when, and you know, what are those offices doing, and what kind of, as renters, what kind of decision making and influence do we have in terms of power consumption and efficiencies and whatnot. And also shipping, right? So we did a lot of shipping because we had distributed employees, shipping out different perks to help people who work from home feel involved and included in the things that were happening in the offices. And we also shipped a lot of servers to the data centers that we ran. So this was, you know, there are some holes in this analysis all the way throughout, but we tried to get the biggest chunks of activity that we could. And all those holes are also eliminated in kind of the what's next section of the project. So moving on to another category, marketing activities, especially in the tech world, we do a lot of swag and stuff we all get is what that acronym stands for. T-shirts. So even though this was a software company, we had to think about being a t-shirt production company and think about who are we working with, what materials are we using for those t-shirts, and the different implications of having a 100% cotton shirt versus a cotton mix shirt, for example. And we were sending out hundreds of thousands of shirts per year. So that was really important for us to understand that impact. And it allowed us to talk to our vendor more and kind of express to them that this was important to us, that their business practices in terms of climate were important to us. Moving on from here, we have travel and commuting, which is obviously a really big thing in many industries where folks either travel between coasts or between countries for to work with one another or to go to professional conferences. This is especially true in a distributed company where almost all the employees are visiting. If you don't work at a headquarters office, then you're probably flying to visit that office once or twice a year. And this also brought into the fold, you know, how are people getting to work, and are they going to work? And if they're working at home, then, you know, how do we account for their activity there, and the company's activity to facilitate that work from home. So everything from air travel to ground travel to commuting to offices and between offices is taken into account here. And you know, this was one of the places where we could get some really specific information because we could talk to the people team, get data from our employee kind of centralized travel agency hub and all that, to get pretty high confidence in these types of numbers. And finally, that brings us to a summary. So those are the high level 5 categories, and all of that math that I just showed you, trickles down into a couple pie charts, which showed us what we originally believed, which was data centers were our #1 emission source. And then removing the data centers from the graph on the left here, the chart on the left, to the one on the right, where you see air travel becomes the big one, along with commuting, once we remove that data center variable. So this allowed us to really get, as a company, the first fundamental glimpse at what our impact is, what our carbon footprint is, what the footprint of each of these big buckets of activities is, and allowed us to start thinking about, okay, now we have a little bit of self-awareness. If we want to do something, we have a starting point. So that brings us to the reflections and results. Before I jump back over to the slides, I want to just point out to you, in case you do jump into the spreadsheet and use it in to any degree, pretty much everything that's linked throughout all of these tabs is summarized right here. All the different calculators we used, other tools across the web, including open source projects for those more technical folks, a lot of research articles, and again, some inspiration and other case studies. And the rest of these tabs are a lot of kind of deep math right at the end to get to, that went into some of the determining the efficiency of our software, the code we were writing, the efficiency of our data centers, each server that was deployed in those data centers and their power consumption over at peak time versus non-peak time, all that stuff. And also two other things here that I'll point out. One is the future work. What else can we do to continue this project? And another is kind of one of the results of community feedback repository, which from a messaging standpoint and a turning this into greater action perspective, we felt like this was one of the most compelling things that we could continue to do as we had these conversations internally, which was bring the voices of our community members, our customers, inside the walls of our offices, quote unquote, to make sure that we're listening to what the people who pay us are asking and are expecting of us. So jumping back over to the reflections, from a requirements standpoint, what do you need to get this going? If you were to want to do this at your company, whether you're a founder or you're an employee, the three basic ingredients to this, in my estimation, are people, time, and energy. Since we're finishing up Energy Week here at Terra.do, I'll differentiate this energy from what we've been talking about and say the energy I'm talking about here is that within our human bodies, and it amounts to physical energy to get it done, emotional energy, as we all know, and psychological and spiritual, because this work is tough and there are challenges to it. But the people part, it's just about having someone who cares, and that's where I started. Was I really cared about what we were doing. I cared about knowing what our impact was, and once I expressed that care to others, I found that others cared too, and they cared enough to join me in an effort to do something. So ideally, you have a group of people who not only care, but represent different perspectives and bring different experiences and different levels of connection throughout the company to this team of people who makes this effort together. But what isn't needed is any climate action work. None of the folks who joined me in this initial effort had any experience doing any of what we did. We just jumped in and figured it out. So I think that's really important. On the time side of things, this is an example of employees going above and beyond their job descriptions. So we were fortunate enough to have this built-in internal hackathon event, which lasted, a Thursday and a Friday, and everybody in the company had support in stepping away from their day job and spending 24 hours to work on whatever they wanted to. And this is what we chose. So, I know that's a a big privilege, and not all employees, not all companies offer that type of privilege. But 20% time is something that Google coined many years ago, and has been more and more common within the tech industry, at least, and also maybe called creative time. And then, you know, if you care enough and you don't have the privilege of having this built-in extra time, then it might require some overtime work, which I personally have trouble suggesting, because balance and health is important. But you know, sometimes we just got to do what we got to do. So those are requirements. The challenges that I experienced in this kind of came in 3 different levels. One was conversation with my manager, because I was doing work outside of my my described job. And at one point, my manager literally came to me and said, "Hey, you know, this is great and all, but I wanted to just make sure you're doing your job." And so I focused on making sure I did my job very well, first and foremost. And I also expressed to him that climate work is everyone's job, and it's not work that we can ignore. So I was firm in saying, you know, my performance speaks for itself, and also I'm going to do this work because someone has to do it. And that went over okay, because the proof was in the pudding in terms of the rest of my responsibilities being taken care of. Another conversation is at the executive level, the C level, and VP level, which at a company the size of the one I was working in, there is more separation between the C level and the rest of the employees, and the conversations those 2 groups of employees are having are often different. And so when I tried to have a conversation about this stuff at the C level, I was met with crickets, and that was challenging and frustrating. But my best reaction to that was keep asking and keep talking about it, and modifying my approach as I persisted to try to speak their language. I understood that our CEO, who was a former CFO, was very focused on free cash flow as a #1 business metric, and something he was always aiming for as the CEO. So I shifted my language to not so much focus on the great things we're going to do for the planet, but focusing on how, by doing great things for the planet, it would do great things for our free cash flow. And finally, this concept of authority versus agency. Authority to me means you have permission, or you have explicit guidance to do a thing. Agency is just the ability to do something. And I think that in this instance, in this context, even if you don't have explicit permission, if you're doing a good thing and you do it well, then all you need is the agency and the ability to go do it. And finally, some results. We achieved that thing that we set out to achieve, which was increase our organizational awareness and have a baseline carbon footprint understanding. We created an employee community, which didn't exist prior, which emerged very quickly and was very much appreciated by the participants, and served as an emotional support network. The meeting that we had directly following, a couple weeks after the hackathon, was literally about 20 people sitting in a circle sharing their experiences with climate change and their relation to it, and a lot of tears were shed, and it felt very meaningful and very connective. And I think really went a long way in terms of establishing relationships and helping people feel less alone at the company. Out of that broader community, a subset of those folks became the go-to people for anything climate related. So we went from having conversations, questions coming in about climate, about sustainability, and no one to field them, to having a go-to group of people who could have those conversations with customers and with coworkers, which was a big improvement. And as I showed late in my presentation of the spreadsheet there, we had a centralized repository that was growing of customer and community feedback to help with that communication process with the C-levels, executives. We established new relationships and avenues for collaboration with teams within the company that we'd never had worked with before, including the trust and governance team, and creating our first climate-related FAQ, and just really starting high-level conversations about our future capital investments with legal and finance and operations and engineering, which were folks that I just didn't work with that much in my day job, which was nice to find those bridges. And with this greater self-awareness and a starting point and a foothold of where we are, we were much more able to have substantive conversations with our community members when that topic came up through social media and forums and support tickets and whatnot.
Hey Tim, sorry to interrupt you. I don't know if you're seeing the chat, but I think your slide advancing is maybe behind. You're on the requirement slide still. At least that's what we're seeing.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, now we're seeing, oh yeah.
Are you on results now?
Yeah, now we
now
can
we're
see
on
results. Thank you.
Thank you.
Something got mixed up there because I skipped over challenges. I'll go back to them, but on was my audio okay that whole time?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's the results. I'll go back into presentation mode so they're big. I was down to the kind of internal blog post and just the following activity, which was a lot more membership in the Slack channel and that follow-up conversation that I mentioned, where our initial group of 7 people grew to 20 people and really allowed us to connect on this common care. Actually, I did do the challenges. So finally, and we can open up for discussion after this if we have any questions or inputs, perspectives from others. These are my top takeaways: that climate action, climate work doesn't have to wait until your next job. I'm no longer with this company, and my time there ended a couple months after I kind of finished this or undertook this project. But when I did take it on, I was in a place of feeling that I needed to do something in the realm of climate action, and feeling a little stuck because I wasn't in a climate action company. I was in a cloud hosting company. But once I reframed from, okay, I got to get out of this company and go do something different, to what can I do differently within this role, that opened up a lot more hope, and it opened up a door for action. So I know a lot of us in this cohort some of us are in that bucket of like, I'm in a job and I see this vision of myself doing more climate action work. And I just want to like present the possibility to us all that switching jobs is the only answer. Creating change at your current company within your current role is an option. And you don't have to wait. You don't have to necessarily leave a stable or comfortable job during a pandemic. You can start doing this work immediately. The second thing is that climate work catches on, as soon as I brought this conversation up, as soon as I pitched the idea to the hackathon, the folks who were planning to participate in the hackathon, I had an overwhelming response. And I found that this was a conversation that just hadn't seeped beyond the surface yet, that people just weren't talking about it, even though they wanted to. So if it's not a conversation at your workplace today, and you would like it to be, I would encourage you to just start a Slack channel, or however conversations get started at your company, and just create a space for it, you know, because I would put money on it that some coworkers are thinking about it too, even if you haven't talked about it before. And finally, start small, right? Like, as I just said, even if it's just an online virtual space for people to share their feelings, that's something, and it's more than nothing. So don't try to put too much pressure on yourself to make a huge difference or make a huge impact or change everything in a short amount of time. Just start with what seems most accessible and within reach. So those are all my takeaways. The rest of this deck, which again, I'll make sure everybody has if they'd want it, it's just kind of a template of sorts to share with the rest of the organization what the results of our project were and what our plans were, and how to continue getting involved. I will stop sharing my screen now and can jump back into any of that stuff if it's helpful. But yeah, sorry I wasn't looking at the chat there. I'm just catching up with it now.
Oh, no problem. Thank you so much, Tim. That was a great presentation. Very inspiring to hear about your work with the carbon footprint audit. And for those of you, I was having some difficulties keeping up with the slides. I think there might have been a lag with you advancing and the screen sharing not reflecting that. But Tim did post the presentation slides and the spreadsheet at the very top of the Zoom chat, which might have been before some of you joined, but it is available there. And Tim, thanks for clarifying, like while you were speaking, sort of how to use those two resources, because I think they're great resources that many of us might look back on in the future. So those are both available there.
Hey, Tim, just a question. I may have missed this. Did you and your team design the spreadsheet, or did that come from Climate Action Tech, and you worked to implement it at your company?
We designed it. We created it ourselves.
Designed it. That's so awesome. So I posted in Slack. We're using it now at Techstars. Like we're
really?
using it to design our own ESG policy right now. Yeah.
Awesome. Yay.
Wow.
That makes me happy.
Yeah. So I'm happy to share our experience as we go through it.
Yeah, I would love to hear it. And yeah, I'm guessing that you all made a copy of it, and I have made some modifications to the original version that I think I shared with the Climate Action Tech folks, mostly aesthetic, like I said, for accessibility reasons. But yeah, it's awesome to know that you picked it up and it's being used in the wild.
Yeah, that is awesome that it's already circulating out there. And I feel like there's a lot of exciting use cases for this kind of a tool. So I'm going to jump into the questions from our Slack channel. The first one was actually from me, so I'll maybe just put that out there because I'm curious. Is it your sense that companies would potentially, either other companies, not the one that you worked for, like either pay their employees or hire consultants to do this kind of analysis for them in the future, especially as like part of carbon neutral pledges? Or, I mean, it seems like such a valuable tool to just initiate that process of planning for carbon neutrality. Or is it your sense that this is really something that's going to happen on a volunteer basis of motivated employees within the companies?
Both is my guess. I liken this type of work right now, especially, not only because it's literal connections and interwovenness, but also because of the similarity of nature. I liken this to D&I work, diversity and inclusion work, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is something that, you know, again, I speak highly, mostly from the tech industry perspective, because that's where I've been working the last 10 years. But diversity and inclusion has, you know, especially right now with the Black Lives Matter being at full speed, has been a conversation for years now. But for the most part, companies hire one person maybe to be like the head of diversity and inclusion, and then they ask people to volunteer, which is controversial amongst employees. I think that a lot of companies will do the same with climate, but I have seen some companies building climate teams and taking this more seriously. Stripe is one example of a tech company that I've seen has like climate as a category within their jobs page, and folks who have been, you know, list climate at Stripe as their in their Twitter bios. So yeah, that's my hunch. I will say that, you know, the company that Kamal mentioned that I'm advising right now, Weaver, I meet almost weekly with their CEO, and he always expresses interest in what I'm learning here at Terra. And in our last meeting, he expressed that he thought that a lot of founders and leaders of companies these days that are emerging, that are thinking more progressively, will want to hire people to give them advice and at least consult in this area, to start building out more expertise internally.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see how that evolves. And yeah, I like the parallel that you drew with the diversity, equity, inclusion work and the climate work that a lot of companies and institutions are trying to take on, but right now a lot of the times is controversially not always compensated. Let me get to the questions in the Slack because there's quite a few coming in. Ryan, did you have a question or was that a comment? Or you did have both? Maybe go for whichever one you want.
Yeah, I have a bunch. I'll stick with one for now. But first of all, thank you, Tim. So did you all look at any of the standards around this, like GHG protocol or CDP? I was curious what you thought of them and if they got any traction.
Because of the time crunch of doing this in a 24-hour period initially, the depth of our research wasn't very deep. So I guess the short answer is no. That would be kind of if it's not listed in the future work to do, then I think that would be a good addition there. I know staying engaged with the climate action tech community, where I last presented this, there's a greenhouse gas emissions channel within their Slack community, and a resource that one of their organizers shared within that channel. I put in the resources here because it got to that greenhouse gas emissions protocol, GHG protocols thing, and it offered a model for what they call, let's see, it was a new term to me. Scope 3 evaluator is the name of so Scope 3 emissions being those that are kind of out of somewhere else in the supply chain and in more indirect than the Scope 2, which is also indirect. So yeah, that comes from the greenhouse gas protocol.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for asking that.
Cool. And Ryan, we can come back to you if you have more questions building up. But let's see if we can get to Liam and then Ani. Liam, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure, yeah. Hey, Tim, thanks a lot for that. it was just kind of if you can estimate the time scale that's required. I guess you did it in a really crunched down way. So if you were talking about a small or a medium enterprise, I don't know, one office with 50 to 100 people, have you got any kind of sense of how long it would take to do that and how many people might need to work on it? Is it like one person working for a week or two people working for a month, or what kind of scale is it?
Yeah, for that type of enterprise, 50 to 100 people, one office, I think that 3 or 4 people could work on this for a couple hours a day for 1 to 2 weeks and accomplish what we accomplished in a much less stressful way.
That's cool to hear.
Yeah.
I don't know if Liam has any follow-up to that, but that is helpful and makes a lot of sense. And I think as just a side note, I've worked with a few farms that want to do this too, like a carbon footprint analysis of their heavy machinery operations and carbon sequestration potential, compost application. And so they're kind of trying to do both kinds of audits similar to what you just described, with sources of emissions and potential sinks, so that they can try and optimize for reducing emissions and increasing sinks with a similar type of spreadsheet as a first pass analysis. So those of you interested in food and ag, I think that's another cool application of a tool like this. Okay, let's see. Ani and then Ben also had a great question in the Slack. So Ani, go ahead. And
Tim, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I think super useful application of what we're learning. And I really do, I see this scaling up across many organizations. I had 2 questions. One of them is, have you thought about ways that we can get the final carbon footprint number of an organization onto their quarterly statement? You know, kind of right above the profit line. And if we can do that, it makes it so punchy because investors can see it, consumers can see it. It becomes, tied to the bonus of executives in that organization. So are there any ways that we can actually get that number onto the quarterly statement? And the second question is, have you thought of an extension of this for true cost labeling on products?
So those are really great ideas and questions. For the quarterly statement, this company is a private company, and so the quarterly statements would basically be seen by the board. In a public company, obviously, there's going to be, even in a private company, you could make those statements more public. You could publish certain elements of them or all of them if transparency was truly a value. But, I think the pessimist in me says that it's gonna something like that will just require the CEO of the company being very adamant about transparency and very committed to accountability. And sadly, in my experience, accountability is a word that's spoken a lot and it's not acted as much as it is spoken, which is very ironic given the word and its meaning itself. So yeah, I think it's going to take cultural change within a private company to reveal that information. It's also going to take, prior to that willingness to expose that information, it's going to take a lot more work than just this for any company to reach a level of confidence to make a public statement about where they are at, and trying to find other examples beyond the 2 that I listed in Basecamp and Space Ape games. I couldn't find many other, even with Stripe, Like Stripe has this, like several posts about what they're doing, but they don't post about where they are. They don't post like, what is our carbon footprint? So I think the two hurdles are people finding the self-awareness and finding the confidence in knowing where they are with this, and two, having the fortitude to come out publicly and state it. On the second one, how did you phrase, what was the term you used for that?
You know, your calculator looks pretty much ready to be scaled onto consumer products. It's the same application. So do you see this relevant for true cost labeling? You know, the way Unilever has now said, okay, all our products are going to have true cost labeling of carbon emissions. How cool would it be to live in a society where every product has a true cost label of carbon, right? And your calculator looks pretty much the basis for that.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the primary, those initial intentions that I mentioned. One of our primary applications, desired applications of this, was to, as a hosting company, be able to put within our customer dashboard, when a new customer was spinning up a new server, they already have the ability to pick which data center that server is deployed. We wanted to reveal to them the greenness of each of those data centers so that they could prioritize, they could pick to, because some of our data centers were powered by renewable energy, 100%, some were 50%, some were 0%. So we wanted to like give them the optionality there and give them the information to make that decision. We ran up against problems with that, particularly in our case, in that if we created that option, we knew that our green data centers would become overloaded and we would run out of capacity very quickly, and therefore not be able to offer it to everybody who wanted it. So there were those considerations, and also considerations around customer experience in terms of latency, for example, where informing a customer, where I think the challenge becomes giving all information to the customer. What are the implications of choosing this green data center in terms of your application performance, which then leads to your end customer experience? And are you willing to pay more and get less, and your customers to have a less experience? So yeah, I think that is one of the kind of pinnacles of this type of work, is equipping consumers with that type of information. And I would love to see this tool or any other tool like it lead to more of that. I think it kind of comes back to those same cultural challenges that I mentioned in the first part of the answer, though, as well as the technical and logistical challenges.
Yeah, and related to what you just shared as an answer to Ani's question, Tim, one thing that I really appreciated about your talk was how you also pulled out the non-quantitative benefits that came out of your experience in terms of employee, like just the experience of doing it was valuable for people at your company to come together and have conversations they weren't already having. And that, to me, whenever like I've done sort of similar but less extensive exercises, and there's been a trouble around getting to a number or arriving at a way to communicate that number in a meaningful way, I think also like what you said and what should be continued to share in this kind of process is just the value of doing it as an exercise, because I think the quantification isn't the only important outcome, and thinking about things holistically, I think, can lead to improvements in practices, you know, in addition to the tool of having that number, but not being a slave to the numbers. So thank you for sharing that perspective as well. Let's see.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
Just to add on to that, you know, employee relationships improved because, like, from my perspective, going into this, I thought putting that green score next to the data center selector was a no-brainer. But then I got to learn, I asked the people who would be affected by that kind of change, and I got insight that I never knew about our product and how things work and how the customer experience is. And understood the challenges of doing something that I thought was a no-brainer, and that those challenges are real and they need to be thought through, and that thinking through that really strengthened empathy across the organization.
Nice. Yeah. I know. Sometimes when I say, oh, we should just do things this way because it's so much better, like, then really talking to those people who are like, no, well, we don't do it that way because of this, and understanding the real challenges to overcome is a crucial part of affecting those kinds of changes and not just calling for them. So yeah, that's a huge takeaway. I want to get to Ben and then Toril. Ben, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Tim. I think, yes, really impressive framework. It's super kind of detailed and replicable. So thank you for sharing it. I was just interested to know if you identified any opportunities or kind of quick wins for footprint reductions in the course of doing the audit.
Yeah, one of our classmates did the presentation on swag earlier in the cohort, and that was, he went way deeper than we did, but that was the number one thing that I saw as an opportunity to immediately just make a different decision. It's as simple as changing your order with the t-shirt vendor, and changing your promise to the community, and changing your offer to the community. We've gotten stuck in this assumption that everybody wants another t-shirt, and like this process allowed us to like break out of that and say, like, maybe people don't want another t-shirt. Maybe we can offer them something completely different that doesn't require packaging, doesn't require shipping, and gives them the same warm and fuzzy feelings inside. So that was number one. Shipping in general, non-swag related, was another big one that I identified, because again, getting into this kind of double-edged sword of like, well, we want to do all these nice things for our employees and give them perks, but like, do they really want that water bottle with the logo on it? Like, no, they don't. They have a glass in their kitchen. So making different purchase decisions, like recognizing the beauty of being a software company and not having to create physical things, and allowing us to kind of lean into that beauty. And then the final thing was air travel, and bringing that into, again, switching our default mode from you just fly to get to the meeting to don't fly, like at all costs, don't fly. We have Zoom, we have these beautiful teleconferencing systems in our offices, use them, right? And we can all agree that being in person is superior to being remote, but is it necessary? That's the question. Is it necessary? And I think that's especially important for employees to hold up as a mirror to their executives. Because, I mean, I've been there myself as I worked my way up, and I was like, oh, I'm a director now. I can just, and they said I can fly anywhere, and I just like, don't even think about it, just fly, because that's the expectation. And my ego has me feeling very important, like I need to be there in person. And I think it's really important that we, to ourselves and to each other, like hold that mirror up and say, like, is your physical presence really that important? Or can you make a little extra effort to be there, to be present in a digital way, right? Can you be on that Zoom call and not be on your computer typing in some other thing, right? Like, that will overcome some of that challenge of not being there in person. And really having executives be honest with each other and say, like, okay, I'm going to be the CEO. I'm going to be based in this state, and the company wants me to be in this state, and therefore I just get to fly all the time. Like, challenging that assumption is really important.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Yeah, great question and great response. Toril, did you want to ask your question, or was that mostly a question meant to just generate more links in conversation, moving forward? Or if you have a specific, go ahead.
No question really. I was just very curious whether what Tim just explained, if any effort is being replicated in Global South. Turns out there are a few things. So I'm just interested in understanding the space a little more.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we should continue to share resources around that for sure. As I think, I don't know all the carbon footprint calculator tools that you shared. I'll have to look into those in the tool, Tim. But we'll also be sharing a few more as part of the carbon offsets class. And so some of them are based in various countries, and I think a few are based in India. So it'll be interesting to look more into those as well and discuss as a cohort. Yeah, cool. Well, does anyone have any additional questions that I have either missed or have just come to you now, or we're feeling good?
I have one final question. So this is kind of just riffing off the earlier question about product labeling and getting this kind of information in the kind of quarterly reports. Is there an opportunity to kind of make this kind of reporting more kind of demanded by the investment community, and something that is expected to be reported on for new potential investment opportunities for existing portfolio businesses? Like Tim, I'm not sure what the ownership structure was for your for the organization in question, but it seems to me like that would be a real kind of turning point if there was more demand within the financial community for this reporting to be standard.
Yeah, I agree with that. Definitely welcome any other perspectives on it. My reaction to it is, the exposure through Terra to Matt Eggers. Is that correct? Which then led me to discovering, actually someone shared it in our Slack as well, that Chris Sacca launched Lower Carbon Capital. I think that perhaps some of the most influence on investors can come from investors. And Chris Sacca, for example, he's like a celebrity within the VC world. He's been on all the startup podcasts, and he was like, his story of becoming the #1 investor in Twitter by like scrapping together loans and credit card checks and stuff like this. Like, I think people like him have a lot of opportunity to influence other investors, more so than entrepreneurs influencing investors. My experience within the venture capital community has been less than awesome personally. So again, my inner cynic comes out when I think about how likely it is for investors to be the ones to drive this change. But then again, like, they exist, right? We've met them. And I know a lot of venture capitalists who, on a personal level, are wonderful human beings. So yeah, that's where I would go. That's where I would lean, because I don't think that entrepreneurs that have that much sway on the investors. It seems very much a power dynamic in the opposite direction. Anybody else have thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's the same as ESG funding, right? In a sense. So you're talking about Chris Sacca at a VC level, but a lot of funding is now completely being earmarked as ESG funding on a private equity level. And essentially they are making it a criteria to say, show us your carbon footprint, show us your water footprint, right? And in fact, through COVID, there's a lot of data coming out to say that companies that are ESG compliant have not been hit so hard by COVID as non-ESG compliant companies. And there's like indexes showing how ESG funding is actually done, investments have done a lot better. So the point is, I think there's levels of environmental awareness, even in climate finance, right? And data like yours, like your calculator, I think should be a prerequisite for that ESG funding.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It highlights, again, part of my perspective is somewhat narrow from a financing standpoint, in that it has mostly come through exposure to and participation in the venture capital process, as opposed to other financing processes.
Oh, I was just going to say that we have 2 classes coming up on finance and climate change as well. So we'll get into a little bit more around this as well.
Yeah, it's a rich topic for sure. Well, thank you for those great food for thought questions and ideas and resources, Tim, and thanks everyone for your awesome questions. We'll wrap up our guest talk for today, and it'll be recorded and shared with you all soon via Slack and in your cohort drive folder. So thanks everyone. This is, yeah, it's really a lot to think about and take away from all this.
Thank you all. This was really fun.
Thank you so much, Tim. This was awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right.
Have a great rest of your days,
evening, morning, afternoon.
Yeah. Take care all.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye, Mom.